But as Professor Morishima pointed out, whether it is still quite effective to divide the countries into only two categories. There are BRICS, there are small island state countries, landlocked countries, sub-Saharan African countries. Are they dealt in the same way? That is one of my questions to be further discussed. And another thought I have, I wish to ask to Tom is whether we should be based on when we should be based on the CBDR respective capability, should it be just directly linked with the right to sustainable development? Because the right to sustainable development is a very big, broad issue. We have been challenging these goals through the MDGs or sustainable development goals. If we directly link these two, that will make the negotiations quite complicated. That's an issue I wish to raise for your consideration and discussions. Thank you very much.
どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. Dr. Suzuki already has posed a question to Mr. Tom Atanaju, but you don't have to just concentrate your questions on Mr. Atanaju, but we have only 14 minutes left. So perhaps I could ask 3 or 4 people in the audience to ask a question. So when you receive the microphone, please identify yourself and be very brief in your question. No, that person in the back, yes, no, 2 rows back. He was the first in raising his hand, so please.
We're working for the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sport, Science and Technology. My question is directed to Director Park Yong-woo. You strongly suggested that even without innovative technology, we, the international community, could possibly fill the gap of the environmental problem. I myself, in this context, admit that the Japanese science and technology policy might have previously overemphasized the technical side of innovations. My question is whether your suggestion, if so agreed as international consensus, might possibly discourage the investment of private companies, not only Japanese companies, but also many others worldwide, which have been so eager for technical innovation for the environment.
So that私元外務省にいたもので赤尾と申しますけれども。
My name is Akamo, and I used to be with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. UNFCCC, I served as this chair, co-chair, common but differentiated responsibility related session. So I still, in hindsight, question sometimes whether that was positive or not to implement that principle or to introduce that principle. I asked the same question to Dr. Bachari, and he said it's good, but there could be differentiation or revisiting the thinking of differentiation. Today, we heard interesting comments on equity. So far, in our experience, developing countries asserted that under common but differentiated responsibility, China, India, Indonesia are all forced same responsibility, and they try to escape to that kind of position under this principle. But under a new approach, if there could be a new way of differentiating responsibility, that could be very positive. Now, coming to my question, there's this new idea And are you already explaining to the international community at international fora that new idea? And if so, what's the reaction so far from developing countries? I'm all for this kind of idea. Of course, there may not be agreement exactly on the idea that you differentiated, but I would like to support differentiation among developing countries.
DuPont. I work for Mitsubishi UFJ Morgan Stanley in the clean energy finance. I have two questions today. The one is directed to the gentleman at Equity. I think the energy economics are very different from 1900 when a lot of the current countries were developing. There's a lot of renewable energy sources that are almost at grid parity in a lot of countries. What do you think about integrating into your very interesting proposal capability by country, by sector is the first question. And the second question is more general, just a personal interest of mine. At what point, I suppose, at what potential temperature increase would the unpredictability of certain geoengineering technologies outweigh the risk of potential climate change impacts?
Okay. Hello, my name is Regon Jong from UNESCO. Actually, I was a former climate change ambassador for Korea for negotiation leading to Copenhagen. At that time, I exactly proposed the idea of registry to answer to Mr. Suzuki-san's question about how to focus on the respective capabilities. I always mentioned that CBDL is not enough. There is another very important concept, which is respective capabilities. But in the history of climate change negotiation, developed country didn't bring up the concept of respective capabilities enough. Only the CBDL dominated the negotiations. But I brought it up in 2008 in the major economies meeting in Washington, D.C., as emphasizing that why don't we talk about what can we contribute based on our capabilities rather than why you finger-pointing each other. And then as a mechanism for it, I propose a registry, meaning that all the countries in the world, including developing countries, register their commitment in an international registry and the review and the pledge and review. That was what, and also at that time, from a Korean government representative, I was saying that Korea is willing to accept international verification. That was already proposed 3-4 years ago. At the time, there was some positive reactions, but I didn't have any strong support at that time from Japanese government at that time. So I think maybe my idea was not very well understood. And I think still the idea of registry is there from Cancun, still survived, is there. So there is a potential this idea can be still pursued and utilized in a more full-scale fashion. I think so. This is my information for Mr. Suzuki's question. It's already I tried it. And my point regarding how can we fill the gap. I don't think we can fill the gap unless we see that climate action is an opportunity rather than a burden. Whenever we are only talking about burden sharing, it's very difficult that the people can mobilize the actions. So actually in the afternoon, I'd like to emphasize as a speaker that the green economy is an opportunity for climate action rather than just a burden. So, but in the morning yesterday, Mr. Pachauri mentioned that there will be a 3% of global GDP sacrifice if we take a climate action. But UNEP report on green economy said that we'll have a higher economic growth if we pursue green economy. So there's a very contradicting to information. From IPCC, we have to sacrifice 3% of global GDP for climate action. But for UNEP report says that we can have a higher GDP if we green our economy. So there are very strange two contradicting information. But I think we should rather rely on how to make a green economy can drive a higher growth and what are the conditions for it. Actually, that is what I'm going to speak in the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chan, for your, as a fourth speaker. Thank you very much. 大変残念ですけれども、時間が されていますので。
Unfortunately, we only have 6 more minutes.